Well, thank you very much for those very flattering remarks and introduction, Dr. Enrique Dussel Peters, my old friend, for we have been part of a panel at the Mexico Business Summit, and I am very grateful to you for your invitation this morning to speak to you at the Centro de Estudios China-México of the Faculty of Economics of UNAM. I also wish to acknowledge the presence this morning of Ambassador Eugenio Anguano Rock, a very senior Mexican diplomat who has been your ambassador in China and has been stationed in China more than once. So I dare say that I have very little to say or to add on the subject of China in the presence of such a learned audience. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak in English, because as I told you, the only other alternative for me was to speak in Chinese. And that should have been fine, because this is after all the Institute of Chinese Studies in UNAM. But I also wish to say that I am very impressed with your university's motto, which reads Por mi raza hablara el espíritu. It's very important, because this really means the aspiration of students and faculty to achieve cultural, spiritual, racial and territorial unity. As someone who comes from a multicultural background, such as India, it resonates very well with me, and I can identify with this spirit of yours. We have a very ancient saying in Sanskrit, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which really means that the entire world is one family. And that is equally a very important saying by the great sage Confucius, and that is Confucius said, all the peoples across the four oceans are brothers and sisters. So I think it is in that spirit that we value our own individual culture, our pluralistic society, the whole focus being on unity in diversity today, not only in the context of our own countries, but also as global citizens. For we live in a much more globalized world than before. I intend to speak briefly on India-China relations, which is actually a very vast topic. I'm afraid I may not be able to do full justice in the time allocated, which is about 30 to 45 minutes. But I also wish to say a few words at the end, time permitting, on India-Mexico relations, which is equally important for me in my current assignment. Let me begin by saying that India and China, and this is a truism which is known to all of you, are two of the world's oldest civilizations. We have coexisted as ancient neighbors for thousands of years, and we are two of the world's most populous countries. China with its more than 1.3 billion people, and India with its 1.2 billion people. Together we make up 40% of the global population. Now that's a remarkable figure. When you look at 100 people around the world, 40 of them are expected to be either from India or China. And so therefore we think that our destinies are also linked, as we are ancient neighbors, most populous. And today, with the growth engines having shifted to the Asia-Pacific region, both India and China are increasingly the epicenter of the new global economic forces that are emerging, and are also destined to play an important role as a part of the new economic forces that are shaping our world today. As you all know, over the past 3 decades, China has emerged as a very dynamic economic center in Asia, with breathtaking changes that have been set off by its reforms and modernization programs. And despite the after effects of the global economic downturn, most recently in 2013, China still ended the year with about 7.5% of growth rate in its GDP. It really demonstrates the kind of resilience that has been built into the Chinese economy over the past 30 years. They have their stellar achievements, obviously. And India, which began its reforms much later in the 1990s, has also emerged as one of the world's fastest growing economies today. India and China together with a number of other emerging economies around the world. It's no longer restricted to just India and China. For we have seen in Asia the emergence of Indonesia, of high growth rates posted by countries like Thailand and the Philippines. Further afar in Africa we have seen South Africa, Nigeria. In Latin America, Mexico is obviously one of the biggest economies, the biggest trading nation, and one on which we put our long-term bets as being a force to reckon with in Latin America in years to come. India and China, as I mentioned before, are continent-sized countries. We are also, in a sense, continent-sized economies. In my view, we have complementarities. It makes us partners, not rivals, as is often made out in the international media. India and China are not rivals. In fact, we are partners in this great economic effervescence and change and flux that is taking place in the Asia-Pacific region. If China commenced its reforms with infrastructure and hardware, equally India focused first on its knowledge-based industries. If China, for instance, has a unitary structure suited to its own needs, India practices multi-party democracy. If China leads in terms of FDI in the manufacturing sector, India has done extraordinarily well for itself with FDI in its mature financial sector. If China relies on an FDI-fueled, exports-driven model for economic growth, India has relied more on its domestic investments and domestic market, making it relatively resistant to the adverse effects of the two global financial and economic crises. So as you can see, we have each chosen our own models and we each have our own achievements. In a very perceptive article written by Anya Shang, who you may know, he was the associate professor, and I believe he's still maybe at the Sloan School of Management at MIT. He and Tarun Khanna, then professor at the Harvard Business School, they wrote an article in the Foreign Policy Journal number 137 of July-August 2003 that India had managed to spawn a number of companies that now compete internationally with the best that Europe and the United States have to offer. Moreover, many of these firms are in the cutting-edge areas of technology, knowledge-based industries, firms such as our software giants, for instance, Infosys and Wipro. These are well-known pharmaceutical and biotechnology powerhouses like Dr. Reddy's laboratories. All of them have a presence in Mexico as well, but I shall not go into those details. They basically made this point that India had also developed a very strong infrastructure to support private enterprise. Our capital markets operated with great efficiency, they have heard, and despite our flaws, the legal system in India was considerably advanced. Basically, one might say from a macro point of view that the approach to change in China was perhaps top-down, whereas the approach to change in India was perhaps more bottom-up. But this really means that each country chose a system most suitable to its own requirements. Goldman Sachs, as you know, has predicted that India and China respectively could be the dominant global suppliers of services in the case of India and manufactured goods in the case of China by 2050. These two would be among the most dominant economies in these two sectors. In effect, China and India are like the yin and yang of the new economic order. The late senior Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, he had said, with good reason, when he met former Prime Minister, the late Rajiv Gandhi, during Mr. Rajiv Gandhi's path-breaking visit to China in December 1988, of which I was a part, that the 21st century would be the Asian century. He had also added the prophetic vision that it could not be the Asian century without the participation of both China and India. And people like Thomas Friedman, in his book, for instance, The World is Flat, the history of the 21st century, also describes vividly the gradual shift of the global economic center of gravity to the Asia-Pacific region, and the potential role that a country like China and a country like India will play in years to come. Why should Asia be regarded as important, for instance, for anybody? We must note that a full 60% of the global population lives in Asia, and it is this 60% of the global population, not just India and China, but other countries, all add up to 60%. And 60% of the global population has been exposed to 6% growth rates or more steadily for many years. So therefore, Asia and the Asia-Pacific region is really the fastest growing region in the global economy. Latin America is the second fastest growing economy. And there are reasons, therefore, why countries such as India and China must connect more closely in Asia, and countries like Mexico must connect more with countries like China and India. Asia also straddles very important economic trade and cooperative structures like APEC, ASEAN, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And Asia is also witnessing unprecedented flows of capital, technology, and resources. You have your own Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations going on currently, the TPP, and the TPP is likely to ultimately lead to the realization of the dream of more effective trade and economic cooperation across the Pacific Rim. So having said that, let me return back to the topic of India and China. This was the context. Relations between India and China not only date back several millennia, but our ties are bound together by concrete examples of interaction, of give and take. The Buddhism, the religion of Buddhism, for instance, the advent of Buddhism from India to China 2000 years ago forged bonds of friendship and inspired cultural exchanges between China and India. Historically speaking, China may well be considered a country that has influenced the cultures of its neighbors, historically. But India, however, is an early and contrarian example. The impact of Indian culture, such as Buddhism from India, is acknowledged in China as a cultural impact that came from India to China. Indian thought, Indian philosophy did have an impact on ancient Chinese culture. And of course, it was a process of give and take, and we also received many good things from Chinese culture. But there is no gainsaying the fact that Buddhism and Indian thought and philosophy taken across not only by ancient Indian philosophers, but also ancient Chinese philosophers who came to India in search of ancient Buddhist texts, such as Xuanzang, Fa all these people came and sought texts and scriptures and took them back to China. Those familiar with Chinese culture would know that Bodhidharma, the Buddhist monk from southern India, who visited China in the 5th century AD. In China he is called Tamo, and he is revered as the patron saint of the Shaolin monastery in central China. He is also the founder of Zen Buddhism worldwide. Zen, of course, is a Japanese word. In China, in Chinese you would call it Chan, and in Hindi, Sanskrit, the Sanskrit origin of the term is Dhyan. So you can see the kind of cultural impact that was felt in centuries past. Xuanzang, as you all know, the famous Tang Dynasty Chinese monk came to travel to India in from 631 to 643. He was in India for like 12 years, collecting Buddhist scriptures, and his historical odyssey is immortalized by the Ming Dynasty writer Wu Chang'an in the epic novel Xi You Qi, Journey to the West. If you haven't read this in Spanish, and if it's available in Spanish, you must read it. it is a fascinating book of its time, written about 500 years ago by Sujan R, and it really puts into perspective the kind of cultural contacts that existed historically between China and India. In times past, India and China accounted 300 years ago, for instance, in the Ming Dynasty, for 40% of the global economy. Until the 17th century, it is on record that these two countries together accounted for 40% of the global economy, and this is of course before the depredations of colonialism extracted their toll on the two countries. So from a historical standpoint, the peoples of India and China have always sympathized with one another. We had our cultural contacts, but of course these were episodic when you look at 2000 years. It is the 20th century and the imploding age of a globalized world with its telecommunication revolution, information technology revolution, air travel, etc., which actually shrunk our space and made the barrier historically posed by the Himalayas no longer a barrier. And we immediately came into a new kind of contact with each other, a realization that both were emerging countries. India was emerging into its own with independence in 1947. China was emerging into its own with the revolution and emerged as the People's Republic of China in 1949, and that put both countries into a modern, contemporary and new context. And as co-founders, for instance, of Panchsheel, or the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, we, that is India and China, together gave the world abiding principles for the conduct of international relations and diplomacy, which are relevant even today. During the struggle that the Communist Party of China had for its own freedom and independence, the Indian National Congress had sent a medical mission to China in 1938 to support the Chinese Communist Party. So this level of empathy, of coexistence, of mutual respect, of cooperation has always marked India-China relations. These principles continue to guide the framework of India-China relations even today. I have said something already about China having emerged as one of the fastest growing economies, in India thereafter with its own reforms also having achieved its own in the economic sphere. Both these countries are remarkable in that both China and India have together uplifted a very large number of the poor in their respective countries above the poverty line because of the profound economic changes that are taking place in these two countries. After China, India is perhaps the only other country with those large numbers of having used economic development to bring people out of poverty. We attach the highest priority to our relations with China and to further developing friendly and cooperative relations with the People's Republic of China. I understand that was an unavoidable interruption on account of an alarm bell that went off, a seismic alarm bell. Let me tell you that we don't want Mexico to be the epicenter of seismic activity. We want it to be the epicenter of economic activity in the future. So this is my earnest wish for Mexico, and I'm quite sure that Mexico will attain new heights in years to come in the economic field. I was talking to you about India and China, and I gave you the historical context, a context which makes it a historical necessity for India and China to develop good, cooperative, mutually beneficial relations. As I said, today India attaches the highest priority to its relations with China and to further developing its friendly and cooperative ties which have existed throughout history. And today India and China enjoy a full spectrum relationship. A relationship in which undoubtedly there are elements of both cooperation and competition. But competition is not to be misconstrued as rivalry. When we speak of cooperation, elements of cooperation and competition, we are talking about healthy competition. We are talking about competition and cooperation among two very friendly countries and partners, essentially. So this is something which people must realize and must understand. There is no rivalry between India and China. The regular high-level dialogue between our political leaders and Chinese leaders gives the necessary impetus to this relationship at all times. The highest leadership in both countries, and I quoted to you a while earlier what the late leader, senior Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping had said about India and China. And that sentiment continues to guide our thinking even today on both sides. Both the Indian and Chinese leaderships have realized that it is in the interests of both India and China to develop and deepen our relations and to broaden areas of cooperation and not confrontation. So for both, the main and the most important task is the mammoth task of domestic transformation, of economic progress, of economic development in the country. And this is something that cannot be achieved without a peaceful environment, without a peaceful periphery, without a peaceful border between India and China. The border, often the media writes about the boundary problem between India and China. Of course this exists. This is a problem which we are dealing with for many years. The border, I must emphasize, is relatively peaceful. It's peaceful, and we have made progress in our discussions on a boundary settlement. This is one of the longest borders between any two countries. It runs into thousands of kilometers. It runs across a vast swathe of the Himalayas from the east to the west. We have an institutionalized framework between India and China for regular contacts, for regular discussions, for the maintenance of peace and tranquility in the border areas. The rest of the relationship has developed rapidly while we address the boundary question. Our trade and economic relationship is one of our most important ones. India's relationship with China on the economic front is one of our most important ones. China today is India's second largest trading partner. This should not come as a surprise, because most countries today would end up saying the same thing, that China is either our biggest or second biggest trade partner. There's no avoiding that today. China is India's largest trading partner in goods and a major source of equipment for important industrial sectors. Our trade for 2013 stood at US dollars 65.47 billion US dollars. I think that's almost the same figure of bilateral trade between Mexico and China, roughly $65 billion. But India exports about US dollars 17.03 billion and imports about US dollars 48.44 billion. On that count, I dare say we are doing a little better than Mexico, because Mexico is not exporting as much to the People's Republic. So I think the whole question of an adverse trade balance between economies around the world and China is something that is a familiar story no matter which part of the world you live in, and it is something that most countries grapple with. So too is India, grappling with the adverse trade balance and looking for ways and means to promote our manufactured goods and products, our agricultural products in the Chinese market. India and China also work together and stand together on several international issues. We find that our interests coincide on several global issues. We now consult regularly with each other on matters of regional and global significance. We have a structured dialogue with China on climate change issues and counterterrorism issues. In our term as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, we had started a mechanism of consultation with China on all UN issues. So we have frequent consultations in multilateral fora such as the WTO, G20, the BRICS, etc. And during his visit to China in October 2013, our Prime Minister outlined 8 specific areas for cooperation between India and China: energy security, food security, a rules-based open international trade regime, global economic environment, climate change, stable global order, and a peaceful periphery. Our people-to-people linkages have also grown in recent years. We exchange youth delegations, and there are thousands of Indian students today in China, including students who are in medical schools around the country. There is absolutely no reason, therefore, why India-China relations cannot continue to develop positively in the future as they have over the last 30 years and as they have over the last 3,000 years. India has achieved high rates of economic growth, but the challenge for India today is to provide proper education and training to its vast youthful population. A full 50% of India's 1.2 billion people is below the age of 25 years. So we have 600 million people below the age of 25. This is one of India's biggest challenges, that we need to educate our youth and convert this very potent force into a positive vector, for a positive force for economic development, to put the youth into the mainstream of economic and social progress in India in the future. Similarly, one of the largest challenges before China today, which is another country, as I said, with a similarly very large population, is its aging problem. So there is a slight difference between the kind of problem we face because of our population and the kind of problem that China is facing. We are facing the problem of ensuring that our youth is integrated and educated. China, on the other hand, is facing a very, very severe problem of an aging population. And there are people, Chinese social scientists and economists, who sometimes raise the question, will China truly become rich before it becomes old? And that will remain a challenge for China to deal with in years to come. So these are the kind of preoccupations that we have. Our populations, our economic transformation, the need for a peaceful environment, and therefore we emphasize the main point that while we have differences between India and China, including over the boundary question, the important point is that both sides have always shown the ability and the will to manage these differences and to maintain peace and tranquility and to continue to cooperate on a broad spectrum of issues. We have over the years created a very useful framework for bilateral dialogue. There are several agreements and mechanisms for consultations, including between the armed forces of India and China. The armed forces of India and China are in regular touch. They have regular consultations and dialogue, and often also engage in joint exercises between the two countries. This ensures that differences in one part of the relationship do not impact adversely on the rest of the relationship, which is mutually beneficial and extraordinarily important, not just to the future of India and China, but important in the context of regional and global peace and progress and development. So this we look at with great optimism in the future. Our relations with China, we will continue to work to reduce this vast trade deficit that we have currently with China. Last year it stood at an all-time high of US dollars 31.42 billion US dollars, the trade deficit. About 10 years ago, almost 50% of India's exports to China comprised of only one item. It used to be iron ore. Vast quantities of iron ore going to China. But over the years, India's exports have diversified, become more competitive, but there still remain challenges in terms of access to the domestic Chinese market for India's products, information technology products, agriculture products, pharmaceuticals, etc. But we have a forum of CEOs and a bilateral joint working group that addresses these trade challenges. The larger issues of the economic type are also addressed in a strategic economic dialogue that we have. Like the Chinese have a strategic and economic dialogue with America, we have a strategic economic dialogue with China, which has already met thrice, if I'm not mistaken. And there is, in our view, a great scope for Chinese participation in India's future infrastructure development. Over the next 5 years, India is going to spend more than $1 trillion on infrastructure alone, as the Indian economy opens up and vast areas come under a new kind of development. China and Chinese companies will continue to have prospects for participation. We also want to draw upon China's experiences in dealing with the physical, social, environmental and human challenges of mobility and urbanization, environmental pollution, etc. There is scope here to learn from each other. We also want to draw upon China's strength in the manufacturing sector. As you know, the Chinese have fine-tuned the model of high-volume, low-cost manufacturing for virtually every supply line across the world. China is like the factory for the rest of the global economy. So we can learn a thing or two from China's experience here. And we could also share with China India's own considerable strength and experience in the services sector, in innovation, in software and certain manufacturing sectors as well. So both India and China have a very high stake in maintaining this cooperative structure and relationship in years to come. Very briefly before I end, I want to quickly tell you something about India and Mexico. As you know, I represent a large country. It is the 7th largest country in the world. In terms of population, it is second only, and only marginally so, to China. We are a shade behind them, but I reckon in the next 10 to 15 years, we are likely to not only catch up, but surpass China in terms of population. India is 3.3 million square kilometers. China is almost 3 times as large as India, but it has less per capita arable land than India, because a large part of China is mountainous and not available to agriculture. India has 22 official languages listed in our constitution, protected by the constitution, not to speak of the countless other languages that Indians use. India is the world's oldest democracy. I'm reminded here of what my foreign minister told the Chilean foreign minister some time ago in good humor. The Chilean foreign minister spoke of India as being the world's oldest democracy, and the quick-thinking foreign minister of India said that Chile is the world's democracy. Which it is. At the next general elections, rather in fact the general elections that are ongoing in India today, we have 814 million registered voters. So in a short while, India will have a new government in place, but our foreign policy will continue to be guided by the main constructs that have guided it in the past. No reference to India is complete without a reference to Mahatma Gandhi, whose values of peace and non-violence are revered around the world, and particularly so in Mexico. So I should mention this to you because today Gandhi is patrimony of the world, and even in Mexico his statues and busts are to be seen not only in Mexico City but Guadalajara, Acapulco, in San Luis Potosi, in Matehuala, etc. India today is the world's 10th largest economy, and in terms of purchasing power parity, it's the 3rd largest. Its achievements in agriculture, nuclear energy, information technology, etc. are well known. India is one of the few countries in the world, a handful, which has its own full-fledged space program, including a commercial space launch program for other countries. So that is the nature of our economy, built on a very strong foundation of innovation, scientific research, technology, We also have achieved, despite our size and large population, food security. For countries like India, China, food security is always an issue. But with the transfer of the Sonora variety of wheat from Mexico to India in the 1960s, we achieved our green revolution, and so therefore Mexico played a vital role in India achieving its green revolution and food security in the 1960s and early 70s. Mexico was the first Latin American country to recognize India's independence. Our ties were established mutually beneficial diplomatic relations were established as early as in 1950. In 2015, we will mark the 65th anniversary of our bilateral ties between India and Mexico. One of your greatest personalities, the Nobel laureate Octavio Paz, whose birth centenary was celebrated, in fact, on the 31st March this year, was in India for 8 long years during the 1960s as ambassador, and he is the one who can be credited with having brought India to the consciousness of modern Mexico through his outstanding book called In Light of India, Vislumbris de la India. So for us, you are a very important player. Mexico is incredibly important for India. Our bilateral trade is about $6.7 billion US. It's quite evenly matched, but most of your exports to India comprise of just one item, which is crude oil. The Indian export basket to Mexico, in my view, is far more exciting. It has a range of, to tell, it is a very diverse basket with information technology, machinery, pharmaceuticals, chemicals. We export automobile parts, we export motorcycles, tractors, a vast range of goods and services we export to Mexico. Bilateral investments are on the rise. We have about $1 billion US worth of investments in Mexico today in a number of fields. There were names like Industria Química de Falcón, Mexico in Cuernavaca, actually an Indian company, it's an Indian, 100% Indian owned company. Tornel, the radial tire manufacturer from whom you purchase tires for your cars and trucks, it's an Indian company. Flex Americas in Altamira, in the north in Tamaulipas, is an Indian company. Varroc Lighting Systems in Monterrey, which makes sophisticated LED lightings for your automotriz industry, is an Indian company. SMP in Puebla, another big investment, making parts for Audi and Volkswagen, is 100% Indian company. I can't go into all the names, but let me tell you that the process is both ways. From Mexico to well-known companies like Cinepolis, Kidzania, Metalsa, Tremec, you have Rurpompen, all sorts of companies from Mexico today, Softec, are also present in the Indian market looking for opportunities for bilateral growth. I have earlier spoken about the fact that Mexico's own potential for developing ties with Asia is largely untapped even today. And with the political leadership here speaking about more of the world in Mexico and more of Mexico in the world, or more of Asia in Mexico and more of Mexico in Asia, I think there is a great deal of scope for us to work together. Links between Mexico and Asia are not new. Let me briefly mention to you or something that you may already know, that one of the first things that happened when Nueva España was settled was the coming to this place of the Spanish galleons from Asia. In your language you call them now de China. But let's be very frank, China in that time didn't mean China, it meant the Orient. And the Philippines in fact was the place from which the now de China used to come. It didn't come from either China or India. The collection point was the Philippines, where goods from all over Asia, people from all over Asia would collect, and once in a while the Spanish galleons would sail for a place like Acapulco and bring all these goods, services, people, cultural, exchanges from Asia to Mexico. One such person who came during that period was Santa Catarina de Puebla. I don't wish to say this because it's not India's view or position. Mexican biographers of Santa Catarina de Puebla aver in the 3 biographies that are available in Mexico, according to Mexican researchers and contemporaries of this lady who came to Mexico in early 17th century, around 1621 or so, 100 years after Hernan Cortes, that she came from India. And she is the one who is credited with having brought along China Poblana, the dress. She is reckoned to have come from the west coast of India. And I recall that in 2010, when India and Mexico celebrated the 60th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties, both countries brought out commemorative stamps. And the theme in these stamps was, in fact, the China Poblana and the Indian dress, which obviously link us historically together. On a lighter note, in this country I am always referred to as Hindu. Now, this is rather funny for me as the Indian ambassador to be told that by the media or a press article that Embajador Hindu visited Monterrey or visited Sonora, because when I translate it to my language, it sounds to me as if the Hindu ambassador, visited so-and-so place. It's like someone in India calling my good friend and Mexican ambassador to India, Jaime Nuala, as the Embajador Católico, visited. So the point I'm trying to make to you is that sometimes I wonder why the Spanish language as it's spoken in Mexico has not yet evolved a term which fully recognizes the significance of Asia or the mind-boggling variety that a country like India, a secular country like India represents. Don't forget that India is home to all the world's great religions. Christianity has been in India since the time of St. Thomas the Apostle, that's 48 AD, and that's 2000 years. Don't forget that Judaism has been in India since the fall of the Second Temple, that's also almost 2000 years. It is also, India is home to Buddhism, Jainism, Christianity. It is also home to the world's second largest Muslim population that could be found anywhere. So I would love to be referred to as Embajador de la República de la India. That's much better. But with these few words, I think I'll stop here and invite you to raise a few questions if you're interested. Thank you very much for listening patiently despite the interruption.